Today's lecture, the fourth in the series, is called What Makes Us Special, Humans and Animals. And it is about a question that is in a way so obvious that you might not have ever thought to really ask it. So we all probably still today kind of casually assume that animals are in some sense inferior to humans, right? So if we think about the kind of example we looked at in the lecture on ethics where you're weighing up whether to save an animal life or a human life, it seems not just wrong to suppose that you would save an animal life over a human life, but it seems wrong to the point that nobody could even think it, right? So we would think that someone who said, well, I sacrificed the life of a stranger human to save my own dog, most people would think that that was tantamount to insanity, never mind the wrong decision, right? And also in antiquity and the Middle Ages, as far as I know, nobody doubted the principle that animals are inferior to humans. But it's one thing to casually assume that humans are better than animals. It's another to actually give a reason for thinking it. And so what I'm going to do is set the stage, as I have in other lectures, by talking a little bit about the way that this issue looks in Greek philosophy. And I'm going to be talking about Plato and Aristotle. I have to say that of everything I'm talking about in these lectures, the things I'll say about Plato and Aristotle are the most likely to be familiar to you, because I'm going to have to go over some pretty well-known things like Aristotle's function argument, but I won't go into great detail or dwell on it for very long. Still, I need to kind of set it out so that we're aware of that background because it's so important for the Arabic philosophical discussion. And then from there, I'm going to go on to look at two kinds of rationale that were given in the Islamic world for thinking that animals are inferior to humans. And the first is that we're ethically superior to them, or at least some of us are ethically superior to them. As we'll find out, a lot of us aren't. A lot of humans aren't ethically superior to animals. And then we're going to move on to look at the idea that we're better than animals because we have knowledge and they don't. Of course, that relates closely to what I was talking about in the second lecture about animal cognition. But in this case, I'm not going to be talking about the philosophy of mind, or actually even really the epistemology that lies behind this claim that we have knowledge and animals don't. I'm going to be asking, in some ways, a more fundamental question, which is, why is it so good to have knowledge? Again, that might seem like a strange question. We might just think the answer is obvious, but the answer is not obvious, right? Because suppose that there's some good that we could be pursuing in life, which is better than knowledge, and suppose that animals can secure it better than we can, well, then animals would be better than we are. So as we approach this question, we're going to be thinking about the fact that, as we've seen over and over, animals are not rational, humans are. Again, animals here means non-human animals, are often called irrational animals in the tradition. And we've seen that ancient philosophers passed on to the Islamic world, and also, by the way, the Latin medieval world, and even the Byzantine world, but we won't get into that, the idea that reason is distinctive to human nature, and that no non-human animal is capable of reason, even if they sometimes look thoughtful. And so really the central question of the lecture is, what's so great about reason? And as I say, we're going to be looking at two sort of dimensions of an answer. One is that reason makes us ethically superior. The other is that it makes us epistemically superior. And then we have to think about why being epistemically superior would matter. Now, let me spell out a little bit more why this is an interesting question. So I just said in a kind of abstract way, well, what if the goal of life was something that animals can achieve better than we can? That's not a merely idle thought, because sometimes philosophers point out, and here Abu Bakr al-Razi, who I'll be talking about again today, is an example of someone who says this. Sometimes philosophers point out that if hedonism were true, in other words, if it were true that pleasure is the good and that our aim in life should be pleasure, then actually animals would have a better chance at being truly happy than we do, because animals are better at achieving pleasure than we are. Now, how you would know this, I don't know. But maybe the thought would be like, when you're stroking your cat, you can just see that the cat is enjoying being stroked more than you could ever possibly enjoy anything, right? And that actually kind of rings true to me. But in any case, whatever we think about this, Arazi was certainly convinced of this. So he said, a single beast experiences more pleasure in eating and having intercourse than a large number of humans can possibly achieve. Again, he doesn't provide any empirical evidence for this, but he does think that it's true. So the line of argument here is, if hedonism were true, then humans would be inferior to animals. But we know that humans aren't inferior to animals, therefore hedonism is false. Notice, though, that this is not an argument for humans being superior to animals. Rather, that's a premise in an argument against hedonism, right? So it's just assumed that it's absurd to say that animals are superior to humans. In order to find out the reason for that, we're going to have to look elsewhere. But I'm just bringing this up to point out that it's not necessarily a completely uncontested claim, right? So we've got to actually establish through philosophical argument that reason is constitutive of the best possible life in order to show that humans are better than animals or live better lives than animals by virtue of rationality. I think, by the way, that is a good way to put it. So if we think about it in terms of who is living the best life, the most valuable life, the most worthwhile life, that's a good way of putting it for two reasons. One is that all of the philosophers we're going to be talking about in this lecture are eudaimonists. So they all think that the point of ethics is to analyze what we need to do in order to live the happiest life. So within that framework, the question of what is the best person is tantamount to the question, who is the happiest person? And therefore, the question, what's better, an animal or a human, is tantamount to the question, who is happier, an animal or a human? And the answer will be, humans are better because they can achieve a higher level of happiness. So that's one reason why it's good to put it in these terms, who's living the best life. The other reason why it's good to put it in these terms is that it gives us a connection to that same issue I just mentioned that keeps coming up in contemporary animal ethics. If you want to know how to treat animals, then you have to know how much their lives are worth. And so by saying, well, animals live a good life to some extent, but not as good a life as humans, you could actually give a philosophical account of why it would be wrong to sacrifice a human life in favor of an animal life, assuming we do think that that's wrong. Okay, so let's look at what Plato and Aristotle have to say about this. And as I say, I'll try to keep this brief, although briefly sketching anything in Plato and Aristotle is always somewhat hazardous because they're so complicated and every single sentence of their works is disputed. So with your forbearance, I will now give you a kind of quick and dirty representation of some things that Plato and Aristotle say about reason. So something we've already mentioned before and will become important again today is Plato's tripartite theory of soul, right? So there's three parts of the soul: reason, spirit, and appetite. And it's emphasized in the Republic, especially, but also in the Timaeus, that rationality should be dominant over the lower two kinds of soul. So reason has to keep desire or appetite, the lowest form of soul or the lowest part of the soul, in control. And it actually enlists the help of the spirited soul in order to do that, because the spirit gives you a sort of source of motivation. However, the reason also has to keep spirited soul under control as well, for example, by forbidding it from becoming too angry. And in the Republic, Plato says that the rule of reason over the other two parts of soul counts as justice, which of course is the topic of the Republic. So the Republic is about justice in the city and how it's analogous to justice in the soul. And in both cases, justice will consist in the appropriate ruling part being in charge over the part that should be ruled. Something I want to emphasize here is that Plato is not a consequentialist. He's not a utilitarian or any kind of consequentialist. So when he explains why reason should be in charge of the soul, he does not say that reason should be put in charge because things will go better for you, right? So it's not because, for example, you'll achieve more pleasure. Obviously not, because he's not a hedonist. But it's not because of any kind of external good that you would achieve. Rather, the good of having reason in charge over the rest of the soul is that it is just intrinsically good. It's what it is for the soul to be well ordered or just. And having a just soul is better than having an unjust soul. That's the argument. So the argument is that he shows that reason should be, by its very nature, in charge over the rest of the soul. And then he just infers from that that's what we want, right? And this is the case even though he also gives you some reasons to think that it will go better for you if your reason is in charge of the rest of the soul. In particular, whenever he talks about the afterlife, which he does in several myths, which I think I've already mentioned, but not least in the myth at the end of the Republic, he makes it very clear that people who don't live rationally and who are dominated by things like anger and desire have very unpleasant afterlives. Also, in the Timaeus, he says that people who live bad lives might be punished by being reincarnated as animals, as we've already seen several times. So actually, there would be an available consequentialist argument in Plato for putting reason in charge over the rest of the soul, but that's not really why we should do it. We should do it because it's intrinsically good. And I'd like to compare this to something that's sort of relevant for the last part of this lecture, but I'm also just saying this because I think it's an interesting point. Plato also doesn't think that knowledge is good because of the consequences that it brings. So you don't want to have knowledge of the forms, let's say, in order that, for example, you could then serve your city by ruling it well. To the contrary, as he says in the Republic, the philosopher kings actually regret having to be rulers in the city because they would much prefer to be spending all their time doing philosophy and contemplating the forms. So you're not looking for knowledge because you want to achieve something else with it. You're looking for knowledge because it's intrinsically valuable. And I think one dramatic piece of evidence for that comes in the dialogue called the Meno, when he gives us this example where he says, well, if you're trying to get to a city, and the city is called Larissa, if you're trying to get to a city, having true belief about how to get there would be just as good as knowledge. But of course, you want knowledge. You don't want true belief, right? Even though they will both get you to the city. And again, I think it's supposed to be just obvious that knowledge is better than true opinion or true belief. You might object, well, isn't that because like knowledge is stable and isn't going to change, whereas beliefs might change? And the answer is yes, but again, the point there isn't that it's consequentialist. In consequentialist terms, better to have stable knowledge rather than true belief. It's just intrinsically better. How about Aristotle? Well, Aristotle is perhaps the philosopher who, in this whole story, who makes the most out of the central point I'm discussing, namely that rationality is distinctive of humans. So this is something that clearly all of these people are committed to. So the Stoics think it's true, the Platonists think it's true. Basically everybody thinks it's true except for the skeptics, and they don't think anything. But Aristotle is the one who makes it a key step in one of his most famous philosophical discussions, which of course is his function argument, which is in chapter 7 of book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. And here what he's trying to do is establish that the happy life for humans will be a life of reason. And the way he does this is explicitly by saying that plants and animals share a lot of other functions with us, but they don't share reason. So he says that plants and animals lack, quote, the active life of that which has reason on the one hand, and that which can obey reason on the other hand, that which can think. So and here, of course, he's thinking in the back of his mind about the tripartite soul of Plato, right? So there's reason, which is logos, that which has reason, and then there's that which can obey reason, which is the lower soul. And this will be true for him most obviously in ethics, like practical ethical decision making. So for example, if I'm trying to decide whether to run away in a battle, or I'm trying to decide how much to eat at dinner, or I'm trying to decide how to deal with my family members, basically whatever I do in the practical sphere, the good thing to do will be to use reason. And of course, that means being virtuous, right? But it's also true in the theoretical sphere. And it's always important to remember when talking about the whole sort of structure of the Nicomachean ethics, that it also includes a substantial discussion of theoretical virtues, like wisdom, for example. And that, again, would be an application of reason, right? So both in the practical sphere and the theoretical sphere, the good life will be a life in which reason is used excellently. And the reason why that's the best life is that that's the life in which the distinctive activity of the human, as opposed to plants and animals, is being used well. So, and of course, he compares this to things like craftspersons, artifacts, and body parts. So just as an excellent eye is an eye that allows its possessor to see well, and an excellent flute player is one who can play the flute well, so an excellent human is the one who can do the thing that humans distinctively do, namely to use reason, and to do it excellently, not just to do it, but to do it well. So I think that's a good way of then structuring the rest of this discussion. The fact that reason can be deployed in both the practical sphere and the theoretical sphere, because that corresponds to exactly the 2 points I want to make. In the practical sphere, we're going to talk about how rationality makes humans ethically superior to animals. And in the theoretical sphere, we're going to look at how merely having knowledge, or the opportunity to have knowledge, makes humans better than animals. And mostly I'm going to be talking here about Razi and Miskoe, who are characters we've already seen before. And both of them have something to say about these questions, especially the question why humans are ethically superior to animals. And what Razi and Miskoe say about this topic is very similar, except that, as we're going to see, Miskoe is a little bit more influenced by Aristotle than Razi is. So let's actually start with Miskoe, even though he's chronologically later. So like I said before, he lives into the 11th century. Razi lives from the 9th to the 10th century. So Miskoe explicitly talks about why humans are better than animals. And when he does this, he's clearly drawing on material from both Plato and Aristotle. Maybe it's worth mentioning, by the way, that Miskoe, he's not a very famous philosopher, actually. I mean, his work on ethics is pretty well known, but nobody thinks of him as like one of the top philosophers of the Islamic world. And to be fair, he probably wasn't. But one thing that's very admirable about him, or very noteworthy at least, is that he was incredibly well read. And the reason that he was well read is that he was actually in charge of a library, which was extremely ample. And so he's read like everything from Greek philosophy that had been translated into Arabic. And he's also got this whole other dimension of his thought, which is that he wrote a massive historical work surveying the events of the Abbasid Caliphate up to his time. And that's a really interesting work as well. And of course, he's read vast amounts of information there also. So he's like this kind of comprehensive intellectual whose work on ethics is just one dimension of his output. And it's the dimension that historians of philosophy are most aware of. So anyway, he's read a lot of Platonist and a lot of Aristotelian material. For example, on the Aristotelian side, he has not only read Aristotle, he's also read Porphyry's commentary on Aristotle's ethics, apparently. And he's also drawing on a work on household management by Bryson, who's broadly speaking also within the Aristotelian tradition. So he's got this kind of synthetic approach to practical philosophy, which he then imparts to later philosophers who are copying from him, notably Nasir ad-Din Tusi, who's in the 12th century and who basically wrote a huge treatise on ethics and practical philosophy, much of which is just a Persian translation of what Miskoweh has said about ethics. Okay, so that's Miskoweh. So as I say, he's drawing on both Platonic and Aristotelian elements here. And I have two quotations from him which show these two sides of his thinking about the relationship between humans and animals. So here's the Platonic passage. Human beings are constantly in a struggle, and the word there is jihad. They're constantly in a struggle against their souls, using the power of their reason. For they need reason to restrain their soul, to bring it under control, and to stand in the way of their base desires, so that they only partake of these desires to the degree that reason allows and determines, prescribes, and permits. People who do not constantly wage this struggle throughout their lives have no claim to the status of humanity. They are wanton as beasts that roam unsupervised without the oversight of reason. So this is an extremely clear passage, which brings together several of the things that we want to know about Miskoweh's views about all these issues. First of all, he's clearly reflecting the Platonic idea that the good person is the one for whom reason is in charge of the lower soul. And he even talks about it as rationality as opposed to desires, right? So it's clearly an explicit allusion to the theory from the Republic and the Timaeus. Secondly, he explicitly compares people who don't do this to animals. So we have a nice answer to our question. The reason people are better than animals is that people have rationality in charge of their souls and animals don't. But notice, actually, that's not quite what he says. What he says is that some people have rationality in charge of their souls, other people don't, and the ones who don't are at the level of animals. And you might wonder, well, actually, what percentage of humans are managing to control themselves using rationality? And the answer could quite likely be a pretty small percentage, right? And this is a thought that we're going to see creeping into our discussion and getting worse and worse till the end of the lecture, by which time we'll be discovering that there may hardly be any humans walking the face of the earth who aren't effectively animals. But we'll get to that. So this is his Platonic way of reflecting on the relationship between humans and animals and saying that some humans are better, namely the ones who control themselves using rationality. Here's a more Aristotelian passage. And again, this is very clear reflection on the difference between humans and animals, as we'll see from the first sentence. Is there a difference between the human and the beast, apart from our ability to think and discern? Indeed, it is this ability which sets us above others. Through it, we hasten after all good things while shunning everything evil. Through it, we distinguish between good and evil in things and discern the noble from the base in actions, the true from the false in statements, and the real from the futile in opinions. Now, you might say, hang on a second, Peter, that's just the same thing as we saw in the last quotation. Reason should be in charge, right? So why am I saying this is Aristotelian? Well, first of all, remember that Plato and Aristotle agree that reason is what separates us from the animals. So that's something Plato and Aristotle have in common anyway. So you could, as it were, get it from either one of them. But the real reason I'm thinking of this as Aristotelian is that it does not emphasize reason's capacity for controlling the lower soul. Rather, it emphasizes reason's power to form correct beliefs or to assent to true propositions, or however you want to put that. And the rooting of this way of thinking about it in the Aristotelian tradition is shown by the end of the passage. So let me read the last sentence again. Through reason, we distinguish between good and evil in things, discern the noble from the base in actions, the true from false in statements, and the real from the futile in opinions. What he's doing there is effectively quoting a definition of logic which appears in Alexandrian commentaries on Aristotle's Organon. They define logic as an instrument for determining in the theoretical domain what is true and what false, and in the practical domain what is good and what is bad. And of course, he knew this definition. He's read everything, as I already said. And also, this definition was known and quoted around this time, so a little bit earlier than him in the 10th century. There's a famous debate in which we have an encounter between an Arabic grammarian named Sirafi, and an Arabic logician named Abu Bishr Mata, who's actually Christian. And the debate begins with Sirafi asking Abu Bishr what he thinks logic is. And he says, it's an instrument for telling true from false and good from bad, right? So this is just a completely standard idea, and it comes to Miskawayh through this Aristotelian tradition. Razi, by contrast to Miskawayh, really is only latching on to the Platonic idea. So he's not particularly interested in reason making us better than animals in epistemic terms. He's really only interested in the contrast between humans and animals when it comes to ethics. And again, the thing that will make us better than animals is that we can control our lower soul, our base desires, using reason. So as he says, this is the primary respect in which people are superior to beasts, the sovereignty of volition and unleashing action only after deliberation. For beasts are not capable of checking themselves from what nature calls them to do, and they act without restraining themselves or deliberating over it. Now, this actually takes us a little bit further than we had in Miskawayh, because all Miskawayh said was, well, people who don't put reason in charge of their own desires are acting like animals. But he doesn't really say why that makes them like animals, except you might infer, well, animals are irrational, so of course their reason can't be in charge because they don't have reason. But here we get an additional idea, which is actually an empirical claim, or perhaps a psychological claim, but it must be based on empirical observation. And the idea is that whenever beasts, animals, are presented with something that they desire, they immediately go for it. So for example, if an animal is hungry and you put food in front of the animal, then the animal will just go for the food and eat it without deliberating or thinking, is this a good idea, right? So here's something that we might be able to do that an animal wouldn't be able to do. We might know that in 2 hours, we're going to be offered a gourmet meal. But right now, we're offered a not very nice meal. And we're already hungry, really hungry. So I'm not sure if I would pass that test, but some of you would, probably all of you would, because you're philosophers. So you would be able to think, oh, I should wait and not eat this food because I'm going to get better food in 2 hours. Actually, there's a famous psychological experiment that's done with small children called the Marshmallow Test. I don't know if you've heard of this, but they take some very small children, like maybe 5 years old, I forget how old they are, and they say, here's a marshmallow, if you can, or some M&Ms or something, whatever the kid would like as a snack. We're going to leave this with you and come back in a little bit. And if you haven't eaten it yet, we'll give you 2. We'll give you extra. But if you do eat it in the time that we're gone, you won't get any more. And what they did was they saw which kids managed to refrain from eating the marshmallow and which ones couldn't wait and lost self-control and ate the marshmallow. And then they followed how well they did in the rest of their lives and found out that supposedly the ones who didn't eat the marshmallow like had a higher salary and went to university and all this. I don't know how reliable all this is, but it's a very famous long-term psychological experiment. But all they were doing is exploring exactly the same idea that Razi was already pointing out in the 10th century. So Razi, of course, says this not as a kind of scientific observation, but in the context of an ethical work which is aimed at humans. And there's supposed to be a piece of ethical advice that comes out of this. So really what he's doing is he's trying to convince you that you should not act like an animal and that you should control yourself. So as he says, one should control oneself so that at a moment of anger, one acts only after thought and deliberation. One should not, in common with beasts, unleash action with no deliberation. Notice the constant reference to deliberation. The Arabic word here is rawiya. So what deliberation means is weigh up the course of action you're proposing and decide whether it's really a good idea before you do it. Now, that might be something that takes a lot of thought, or it might even be something that you can do very quickly. But the point is that you don't just spontaneously act without thinking about it. You only act once you've decided that it's really a good idea. So as he says, if you don't act like that, if you don't act with consideration, deliberation, then you are behaving, as he says, like male goats or bulls or other beasts. That word beasts, baha'im, is a pejorative word for animals in Arabic. So you shouldn't act like goats or bulls or other beasts which engage in no reflection or consideration about consequences. It's worth pointing out, even though I don't think there's a historical connection here, there's a conceptual similarity between this idea and something we find in ancient philosophy among the Stoics. Because the Stoics have a psychological theory, or I guess you could call it a theory of action, according to which we perform actions when the world has some impression upon us, which gives us the impetus to perform a certain action. For example, I'm hungry and I see food. So the food makes an impression on me that would make me want to eat it. And in a human, the human then must assent to this impression. And if the human assents, then that will cause the action to ensue. Okay, so there's a three-stage process within the human, according to the Stoics. First, we have impression, then we have assent, and then we have action. Or they might say impulse to perform an action. Animals are just the same, except without the middle step. There's no step of assent. They have impressions and they act immediately on the basis of the impression. So it's this, again, I'm not claiming that Razi is drawing on the Stoics here, but I am saying that they have the same intuition about how animals function, namely that animals, apparently by instinct, I guess was how we would say, they automatically respond to their environments by acting on whatever desires the environment prompts within them. Without assenting, without reflecting, without deliberating, they can't do any of that. That's the function of reason, according to Razi. So for Razi, reason has a kind of negative function. So reason's primary function, at least within ethics, is to restrain desire from whatever it might want to do. And this, he says explicitly, makes us better than irrational animals. Not just because we can lead, or well, maybe it is just because we can lead better lives, right? Lives in which we don't act in this kind of instinctive, automatic way, but lives in which we act in a deliberative, wise, well-considered way. But he thinks it has a further consequence, namely that our superiority over animals allows us to dominate them, or even gives us the right to dominate them. So he says it is through reason or intellect, the word is aql again, that we are better than the irrational animal, so that we rule and control them, subjecting them to us and directing them in ways conducive to our advantage as well as theirs. And this is pretty striking, actually, because remember, Razi was the one who wrote this passage where he said you shouldn't mistreat animals, you shouldn't mistreat anything that's sentient, you should never cause suffering, right? And now he's saying, but go ahead and do whatever you want with them, right? You can for example, you're allowed to remember, he said you can't ride riding animals to death, but you can ride riding animals, right? You can use them as almost like servants or tools. Notice, however, that he says that we're going to subject them to us ourselves and direct them in ways conducive to our advantage as well as theirs. So actually, even here where he's giving you a rationale for using domestic animals as you see fit, he sets a kind of limit on that, which is that you should also be considering their welfare. So actually, this is completely consistent with that other passage. This is the other side of the coin, right? So you can use pack animals, but don't overload them. You can ride horses, but don't ride them too fast. You can presumably farm animals for meat, but you shouldn't torment them unnecessarily. Because remember, he left it open whether or not one should be vegetarian, right? This idea is fundamentally grounded in the Platonic theory of soul, by which reason is dominating the lower soul. And in fact, I think that, although Razi doesn't come out and say this, the mastery that humans are allowed to have over animals is parallel to the mastery the rational soul has over the lower soul, right? So it's almost like the relationship of justice within the soul, where reason dominates, is mirrored in the outside world between rational humans and irrational animals. The rational humans are in charge because reason is always supposed to be in charge of the irrational. Just as reason dominates the lower two soul parts, so rational humans dominate irrational animals. Now, Miskoway has a few additionally interesting things to say about this. And he talks about the preferability of human to animal life in some ways a more rich way than Razi does, because he explicitly asks whether the things that make life worth living for humans are present in animal life. In particular, he asks whether animals have virtue and happiness the way that we do. And he says, sort of, but basically not. So let's start with virtue. So there's a really fascinating passage in which he asks whether animals can have virtues. And you might think that they can, because remember, Miskoway is aware of this tradition from Galen, according to which animals have analogs of character traits. Remember the timid rabbit, the courageous lion, and elephant, right? So we talked about this. And so that actually makes it sound like lions can be virtuous, right? They have courage, and courage is a virtue. But actually, he wants to provide a kind of caveat or correction to that impression, because he asks explicitly, is the courage of the lion real courage? And says, it resembles courage, but it's not real courage. For these animals are confident in their strength and that it is greater than others, so that when they attack, they do so not by the nature of courage, but by a sense of complete strength and power and of self-confidence in prevailing. Now, at one level, this is just kind of, I guess, a common sense claim about courage. Like, it wouldn't be brave of me to get into a fight with a 4-year-old, because the 4-year-old can't hurt me, right? And for a lion, pretty much everything else is like a 4-year-old, right? Because they're so strong that nothing can challenge them. So they don't really have courage just because they can't be threatened. But I think there's a deeper line of thought which is underlying here, which is, what is it that makes courage real courage? What is it that makes real courage a virtue? And the answer is, real courage is when you think about whether to face a threat or danger and decide to do it. So again, it's virtue, and it's a part of the good life because it involves reason, reflection, consideration. So you weigh up whether or not, for example, to stand in battle and fight. And even though you're facing a fearful danger, you do decide to do that because upon reflection, which is something animals can't do, you decide to fight. Whereas an animal will just size up, can I defeat this foe or not? If the answer is yes, they fight. If the answer is no, they run, right? There's no reflection or deliberation. Similarly, animals cannot really be happy, but they have a kind of analog of happiness. So he raises this question explicitly and says, happiness is sometimes thought to belong to non-rational beings, in other words, animals. If this is true, then it resides in preparedness to receive their completions and perfections, but without intention, deliberation, or volition, exactly the point I was just making. Whatever animals get from eating, drinking, and being at rest ought to be called luck or happenstance and does not deserve the name of happiness, and the same goes for humans. So here I want to make 2 points, or emphasize 2 things. One is, notice the connection between this passage and what I was saying in the previous lecture about animals having their own good, which is a natural good that they should be pursuing, which consists in their perfection, right? So he says here, the quote unquote happiness that belongs to animals would be pursuing their natural perfection. And remember that we saw before that that's something that is genuinely good, and so we shouldn't hinder it. So this confirms that. That's one thing I wanted to point out about this passage. The other thing I wanted to point out is that, again, he's being very disdainful of humans that only live like animals do. So just, get by with eating and drinking, right? If that's all you're doing, then you might be getting pleasure out of that, but animals can do that. That's not a life worth living. And Miskoway adds to this that even if you live as a human and live rationally, in the sense of doing what Razi told you to do, namely to restrain your lower soul using your reason, that's not enough either. You have to do more than just be self-controlled in order to be a proper human. You have to additionally achieve knowledge. So you have to use your intellect. And this now obviously is going to take us into the theme of epistemic superiority. So the fact that humans' ability to have knowledge, to use rationality, not just control themselves, but to achieve knowledge, that will make them better than animals too. And it will also make them better than humans who only control themselves, but don't have knowledge. So as Miskoway says, the common run of human beings and the masses among the people occupy a station close to that of the beasts. Their rationality and discrimination do not go beyond imparting a certain order with a rational structure to this beastly nature. And this, I think, puts a very different light on everything I've been saying in the previous section of the paper, because I've just been really emphasizing the importance of using reason to control your lower soul and so on. And that's all true. Miskoway thinks all that just as much as Razi does. But then he also says, oh, by the way, if that's all that you're doing, you're only a little bit better than an animal. So as he says, these are the jumhur, which is an Arabic word that more or less has the same connotation as the Greek expression hoi polloi. By the way, folks, do not say the hoi polloi, please, because hoi means the. So if you say the hoi, I mean, I don't want to be pedantic, but no, yes, I do. I want to be pedantic. So if you say the hoi polloi, that means the many. Don't say that. Doesn't make any sense. So hoi polloi is al-jumhur in Arabic. So this is the masses, the many, right? And these people, according to Miskoway, are a little bit better than animals because they do this thing we've been talking about the whole time. They're ethically superior to animals because they control themselves. But that's all they do. They don't have knowledge. They're not philosophers or scholars or intellectuals, whatever you want to call it. They're not members of the ulama, is how you would say this in Arabic. And this is now obviously giving us more information about the question I briefly mentioned earlier, namely how many people are really better than animals? And the answer is, well, if the many are managing to be more or less self-controlled, that makes them better than animals, but not much better, right? They're kind of animals plus self-control. What we want is to be much better than animals, which is to be obviously engaging in intellection. And he even has a more kind of variegated or nuanced picture than that, because within the realm of the animals, he recognizes levels that are kind of analogous to these levels within humans. So just as within humans, we have people who are uncontrolled, who are really bad and are like animals. And then we have people who are ethically self-controlled, but not intellectually achieved. And then we have the intellectuals, so that's 3 levels. So he mentions in his refinement of character that there are 4 levels of perfection among animals. So at the bottom, we have animals that are not similar to humans at all. So I was thinking like shellfish, for example. He doesn't give an example. Then we have animals that by nature care for their offspring. So that already shows that they have some kind of discipline by instinct, like nesting birds. And these are examples, by the way, from now on will be his own examples. Then we have animals that can even be trained by humans, namely horses and falcons. Now, why are those better? Well, because they can take on something that's analogous to rationality, because the human from the outside imposes some kind of discipline on them, right? When the falcon learns to fly back to its owner upon command, let's say, then it's controlling its desires in a way that's been trained into it. So it's not doing that on its own the way a human can and should, but it's still doing it. And then the 4th class is almost as good as a human, because these are going to be animals that actually watch what humans do and imitate it. And here he says that would be like an ape. So he says animals that imitate, he says, describes this class as animals that imitate humans of their own accord and are similar to them without any instruction, like apes and the like. Now, again, I think he would say that's still not as good as a human, because a human, even a member of hoi polloi, can learn to control themselves, right? Whereas these animals have to sort of kind of mechanically imitate what they see humans doing. And of course, it's clear here that because animals are superior to, or sorry, because humans are superior to animals, the best animals will be the ones that are most like humans. But putting this all together, we have this really nice kind of hierarchical picture with 4 kinds of animals and 3 kinds of humans. So we have at the bottom animals that are not similar to humans at all, then animals that care for their offspring, then animals that can be trained, then animals that kind of train themselves by imitating humans. Then we have uncontrolled humans, controlled humans, and philosophers. Or maybe actually that's not true, because maybe uncontrolled humans are worse than animals, right? Because animals at least don't, for example, satisfy desires that they shouldn't be pursuing at all. Like, for example, they don't overeat. They eat until they're not hungry anymore, whereas humans do overeat. And in fact, this is a point that Razi and Miskaway both make, that uncontrolled people are like animals, or maybe even they're worse than animals, right? Because they've debased themselves, they're violating their own nature, and they make even worse decisions than animals sometimes make. Having said that, it's certainly clear that even the highest animals, like apes, are not going to be capable of reaching the highest heights of what the best humans can do, which of course follows immediately from everything we saw in lecture 2 about animal cognition. So they're trapped within a cognitive world in which they can grasp particular objects, but they can't think universally, they can't arrive at intelligible knowledge. And Miskaway describes this in the most kind of Platonic way you could want, echoing the sort of very hardcore dualist picture that we got in Kindi, where we have intelligible objects and sensible objects, and the intelligible objects are better, they're universal, etc. So this kind of 2-level cognition, where only humans have the upper level, is something that Miskaway is certainly committed to. So that's Razi and Miskaway. And as we've seen, they're pretty disdainful about humans that only manage to live like animals. So just to sum up and repeat, animals are not capable of what the best humans do, which will be intellection. But of course, most people don't do that either. Most people aren't philosophers or scholars. And so they're kind of at the level of like trained animals, like horses. Maybe self-controlled people are a little bit better than trained horses because they have more investment in the process, right? They've used will or volition to be deliberately partaking of their own education and training. But I think Miskaway makes it pretty clear that a merely self-controlled human, like a member of hoi polloi, is more like an animal than like a philosopher, right? They're just barely better than animals, as I said before. And this is something that we find among Aristotelian philosophers as well. Because remember, Aristotle says, well, the best life, the distinctively human life, is the life where you use reason not only in the practical sphere, but also in the theoretical sphere. So if you're not using your reason in your theoretical sphere because you're not engaging in intellection, then in some sense, you're not actually living a fully human life. And there are a couple of really remarkable statements to this effect. One of them is pretty famous, I guess. I mean, as famous as anything is in Islamic philosophy. The other less so. So the less famous thing is a passage from Ibn Adi in his mostly pretty pedestrian commentary on the first book of Aristotle's Metaphysics, in which he says, the activity of humanity through which every single person is a human is proper to humanity. It is reason in actuality, which does not belong to them. In other words, it doesn't belong to humans who don't engage in intellection. So these people do not deserve the name of people. The Arabic word here is nas. They shouldn't be called humans. Just as a hand, when it lacks its proper activity, is not in truth a hand. And there's a very similar passage. This is the one I was thinking is better known. It's a very striking passage from one of Ibn Rushd's or Averroes's commentaries. He says, the name human is predicated equivocally of a human being who is perfected by a speculative science and of one who is not perfected by it, or who does not have aptitude to be perfected by it. Similarly, the name human is predicated equivocally of a living and dead human being, or of a rational human being and one that is made of stone. So both of them are echoing something that we find in Aristotle. So think about, there's this passage where Aristotle says that a painted eye is an eye in name only. It's only homonymously an eye, right? So it shares the name eye, but it's not really an eye because real eyes can see, right? Why is the painted eye not a real eye? Well, it's not because it's made of the wrong stuff or something like that. It's because it can't fulfill the function of an eye, namely eyesight. Similarly, because the function of a human is to think and to engage in intellection, at least that's the highest function of a human being, a human that doesn't do that is not really a human, or is a human in name only, like a painted eye, right? Or like a statue of a human could be called a human. Now, this is obviously putting it very, very strongly, what they're saying here. And I think actually Miskoe and Razi have given us some reason to qualify this, because they could point out, well, hang on a second, you Aristotelians, you're always worried about science, but you forgot this Platonic thing about controlling yourself using reason. So you're so focused on epistemology that you forgot that there's also practical philosophy. And in practical philosophy, or maybe not even practical philosophy, but just practical life, right? You don't have to actually do ethics as a science like a philosopher would, but you could at least control yourself, like control your desires, and that would already make you better than an animal and give you some claim to the title of human. But they would still agree that the best humans and the ones who have the best claim to the name of human are the ones who do philosophy and actualize their potential for intellection. Now, you might think, oh, this is kind of quaint and even sort of funny, right? So because like these philosophers saying, oh, we're the real humans because we're philosophers, and all of you normal people like farming in the fields, you're rubbish, you're like animals, right? And so this seems kind of silly and also obviously very self-aggrandizing and self-justifying, right? I mean, to put it even more polemically, these are people who are basically sitting around in royal courts or circles of scholars being complete parasites because they don't do anything useful for society, and they're being supported by all of the poor people who are out in the fields farming. And then they turn around and say to all these people who are actually doing something useful, oh, you're all worthless, we're the real humans, you're just like oxen and horses, right? I sound like a Marxist, sorry. I didn't mean to get all singing the Internationale, I assume. So anyway, so you might think this sounds kind of silly, and I think that actually when one reads passages like that, it kind of raises a smile, if anything. But actually, I think this is far from innocent, and it's an attitude that, although it's rarely expressed as explicitly as we just saw Ibn Adi and Ibn Rushd expressing it, it is an attitude that is pervasive throughout medieval and even Renaissance culture. And to give you like the most powerful example of why this mattered, I would like to mention the way that people thought about the inhabitants of the Americas when the Americas were quote unquote discovered by Europeans. Of course, they weren't discovered because people had been living there for a long time. But when the Europeans, from their point of view, discovered the so-called New World, right? So one of the things that happened is they had a serious discussion about whether these people are rational. And this was important to them, right? Because if they weren't rational, then they couldn't, for example, they couldn't be Christianized, or they shouldn't be, because you don't need to bring true religion to people who have no reason, because they're not real people. They're actually just kind of glorified animals. And there was this long-running debate about the cognitive capacity of these so-called Indians, and what their cognitive capacity would allow in terms of their religious and philosophical and moral education, right? And this plays a role in the debate in the period of the Renaissance. We're talking about like 16th century here, where some more admirable people were arguing that the Spaniards should stop abusing the Americans that they had found in this newly discovered place, and pointed out that there was a kind of hypocrisy involved, because on the one hand, they were going there supposedly to engage in missionary activity, but in fact, what they were doing was enslaving these people and using them for hard labor in silver mines and plantations and so on. And one of the most important figures who protested against this, De las Casas, who was arguing for benevolence towards the Native Americans, described the abusive Spaniards as thinking that the Indians are not rational beings. Another proponent of benevolence towards the Native Americans, Montesinos, asked sort of rhetorically, are these not humans? Do they not have rational souls? Are you not obliged to love them as yourselves, right? Just as a Christian should love all humans. Notice here the similarity in tone to the question of how we should treat animals, right? So we have these kind of supposedly inferior beings. The Europeans stand over the Indians, have guns, and can basically do whatever they want to these poor Indians, much as animals stand over and have violence, have unrestrained capacity for violence against animals. And the question is, how much should we exploit this opportunity to abuse and be violent to these creatures? And here, what the proponents of benevolence towards the Indians were arguing very explicitly is, hey, these aren't animals, because they're humans just like we are. They're members of they're members of the same species, and as such, they're rational, and we should treat them as such, right? So we can abuse animals maybe, but we can't abuse the Indians. Whereas the opponents were saying, well, these people are basically like animals because they're not learned, they don't have the right religious beliefs, the way they act is sort of bestial, according supposedly. And so they have this kind of disdainful attitude towards them, which allows us to treat them however we want, right? And I think that the long tradition of Aristotelian reflection on most humans as being kind of beneath contempt and being in some sense not real humans fed into this very strongly. And I think it's very striking and a case of real philosophical progress that in the meantime, we don't think like this anymore. So as we've seen, people don't think about animals the way they thought about animals then for the most part. And they also, of course, don't think about humans, or we don't think about humans this way anymore either, although it took us a long time to stop thinking like this. So of course, you can find echoes of the same kind of rationale in justifications of slavery. So you have 19th century, endless justifications of slavery in the 19th century, where racist proponents of slavery are saying, well, Black people are basically like animals, so we can treat them as such, right? And I think and this is the thought I'll leave you with at the end of these lectures, I think there's basically been two things that have happened to shift attitudes. First, the idea that humans are better than animals because they can do philosophy and do science and grasp universals, grasp intelligible objects. There's a lot of things we can say about that, but one of them is that turns on an extremely exalted, ambitious idea about what knowledge is, right? Knowledge is basically for philosophical Aristotelian sages and hardcore scientists. So, if you don't have a PhD, you're not even getting in the front door of this theory of knowledge, right? And our ideas about knowledge have really gotten a lot more modest than that. So there's a sense in which, for example, we don't know that it's Thursday, according to this theory of knowledge, because the fact that it's Thursday is not an intelligible universal, right? Where you can't know that the cat is on the mat, according to this old theory of knowledge. Whereas now that's a perfectly, every epistemologist wants to be able to explain how that could count as a case of knowledge. So as our theory of knowledge has become a lot more modest for very complicated reasons, which we don't have time to get into, it's become a lot less plausible to say that many humans lack the thing that makes us distinctively human, namely the ability to know, right? Because if you can know that the cat is on the mat, then anyone can do that, right? You don't have to be an Aristotelian sage to do that. So that's one thing that's changed. And the other thing that's changed is that our assessment of animal cognition has gone way up, right? So we now think that apes, for example, are capable of language, linguistic representation, planning, basically almost everything that humans can do in the sphere of cognition. Some animals can do, at least to some extent. So there's been a real blurring of the animal-human divide. So I think these are points where philosophy and the human race in general has made progress. But I do want to point out that it's not as if this all happened yesterday, or that this only happened because of Peter Singer or because of Darwin or something like that. These are not changes that happened in philosophy only in the last 100 or 200 years. In fact, everything I've just said started to happen in the Islamic world, right? So think about, for example, Fakhreddin arguing that animals grasp universals, right? So he's already trying to obliterate the epistemic divide between animals and humans. Or think about the way, as we just saw, that people defended the idea that all humans are rational and that it's not okay to treat some humans as if they were animals, the way that some Aristotelian philosophers make it sound like you might be able to. So I think that, as so often, things that seem to be very new in the history of philosophy actually have a long history. And one of the reasons it's worth looking at this whole story that we've gone through over the last 4 years, it might feel like 4 years, sorry, the last 4 lectures, is that it shows us how many resources there are in these pretty old philosophical traditions that speak to our current concerns, both in terms of how we feel about animals and how we feel about each other. Thanks very much.